Right. Thank you so much, Rachel. Okay, perfect. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can you all see my screen? Does that work?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight. As Rachel said, I'm Katherine Favor. I'm a Climate Hub's Agroforestry Fellow with the USDA National Agroforestry Center. And tonight we're going to be talking about backyard agroforestry, or just more broadly, small scale agroforestry, just how to grow food in a sustainable way in smaller spaces in the midst of a changing climate. So just an overview of what we'll be talking about. First, we're going to talk about what agroforestry is in general. It might be a new term for some of us. Then I'm going to get into how this land management strategy can be applied to smaller spaces. And we'll also talk about why agroforestry is important in the context of climate change and the other problems that us land managers commonly face. And then we'll jump into the different ways that you can arrange trees on your land to satisfy different goals. And finally, we will talk about some planning and design considerations to take into account if you do want to start your own small-scale agroforestry project. And just a quick note on the National Agroforestry Center. So we are a government entity under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We're a partnership between the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, and the Forest Service, specifically Forest Service Research and Development, and also Forest Service State, Private, and Tribal Forestry. So we research both the ecosystem services and the social dimensions of agroforestry and agroforestry best practices. And we also do a lot of work on science translation, outreach, and education to support agroforestry adoption across the country. And also some background on the USDA climate hubs. So the USDA has 10 climate hubs across the country, including here in the Northwest. The mission of the climate hubs is to develop and deliver science-based, region-specific information and technologies to agricultural and natural resource managers to enable climate-informed decision-making. And another goal is to provide access to assistance in implementing those decisions. So in my work with the National Agroforestry Center, I'm lucky enough to get to work with the Northwest Climate Hub quite a bit. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I am based in San Diego. So I'm in the West, not the Pacific Northwest, but I'm here in the West. So let's get into it. The presentation tonight is going to be about small scale agroforestry, but zooming out a little bit first, I want to just define this term agroforestry because it might be new to some of us. So for those who aren't familiar with the term, agroforestry simply refers to a suite of sustainable land use practices that involve intentionally integrating trees into agricultural production systems. So agroforestry systems are integrated. You've basically got perennials integrated with another type of enterprise on one unit of land. And there are so many different ways to arrange trees and shrubs in agroforestry systems to satisfy a number of conservation and production goals. In temperate regions, these are the 6 most common agroforestry practices or ways we have of arranging trees. So there's silvopasture. That's when you have a combination of trees and forage and livestock on the same piece of land. So you can see in the picture, we've got cattle and pasture and trees all together. Then there are windbreaks or hedgerows, which are linear plantings of trees and shrubs on the perimeter of fields, either to slow down wind or provide habitat for wildlife and support beneficial insects and pollinators. Then we've got riparian forest buffers. That's bands of trees and shrubs, and sometimes forbs and grasses too, alongside bodies of water to promote water quality and healthy riparian ecosystems. And then we've got alley cropping. That's when you have rows of trees that are intercropped with rows of understory crops between. So in this picture, we've got chestnut trees intercropped with cotton. That's an example. And then there's forest farming or multi-story cropping. And that's when crops are grown under the shade of trees, often under the shade of an actual forest, like in this picture, or a stand of trees. And then finally, there are forest gardens or food forests, which are one type of forest farming system where you've got multiple vertical layers of trees and shrubs and understory crops that are all planted together to create a system that mimics the structure and function of an early succession forest. So lots of different ways that we can arrange trees on our landscapes, but overall, the important takeaway here is that all these systems are characterized by high levels of diversity and the smart utilization of vertical space. And I do want to pause and acknowledge that arranging trees in this way in multiple layers to produce food and medicine, this is not new by any means. This is the way that indigenous people in many parts of the world stewarded their land for thousands of years, and how many still are stewarding their land. These here are pictures of the Amazon rainforest and rainforests in British Columbia. And there's evidence that vast parts of these rainforests were actually food forests that were intentionally planted. So, these terms might be new. These terms, agroforestry, forest gardens, food forests, might be new terms for many of us, but the philosophies and the traditions behind them are certainly not new. So that is agroforestry in a nutshell. And we talked about what it typically looks like in the context of production agriculture, but this presentation is backyard agroforestry. So now I want to talk about what it can look like in a smaller growing context. And really, all different types of agroforestry practices can be applied to smaller spaces. So all those practices I just went through, alley cropping, forest farming, silvopasture, windbreaks, etc., all those practices can be scaled down to smaller settings. And it can happen anywhere, from backyards to public parks, to schools, small urban farms to strengthen their production, neighborhoods, even just empty lots or the side of the road, so many other settings. These are just a few examples. So that is what we're talking about today. But I want to pause again here and ask the question of why? Why agroforestry? Why are we talking about this, and how is it useful to you? And I think to answer that question, we've got to talk about the problem. And I certainly don't have to tell you, but there are lots of problems that land stewards contend with in our modern age. Many of these problems are arising from climate change, and some are just other byproducts of human activity. So on the environmental side, human activity and unfettered development has led to all sorts of biodiversity loss, water contamination, compacted soils, contaminated soils, air pollution. In cities especially, the lack of permeable surfaces is causing an increase in stormwater runoff and even flash flooding in extreme cases. And then climate change projections in the Northwest in specific are for higher temperatures and longer periods of extreme heat. And that can be exacerbated even more by the urban heat island effect. And if you're farming, that can lead to heat stress for both crops and also livestock. Climate change models also are projecting more water extremes, meaning potentially bouts of both extreme precipitation and then also drought. And we're already starting to experience that. And then on the production side, land stewards are dealing with production issues like irrigation shortages from reduced amounts of summer precipitation, or also there are going to be projected reductions in snowpack. With warmer temperatures, we can also expect increases in pest pressure because the changes in temperature patterns might affect the range where pests thrive. And because longer seasons without frost might allow pest populations to increase unfettered. So, all these are big problems that we're dealing with. And then unsustainable farming practices can cause problems too, as we know, just like increased erosion, declining soil fertility, dependence on expensive inputs, and inputs are getting more and more expensive every day. So there definitely are a lot of problems that land stewards are facing. And agroforestry by no means is a silver bullet to solve these problems, but it is one tool among many nature-based solutions that we can start to use to think about starting to address some of these problems. So that is the why behind agroforestry. And again, agroforestry can be applied to any number of small scale spaces and settings, but how you arrange trees and shrubs in your space and how you design your agroforestry system, it's going to depend on what problems you're wanting to address and consequently what your goals are. So that's the first step to designing an agroforestry system that I want to talk about. Step one, identify your goals. So the first question to ask yourself is, what are your main problems? Maybe there are problems that I listed on that last slide, like climate change, drought, high cost of inputs, or it could be something else like lack of access to fresh food nearby. But no matter what, I think a good place to start always is just defining and prioritizing your main problems. And then you can start to think about what resource concerns you have. And what do I mean by resource concerns? By that, I mean, what would be the expected degradation of your soil, water, air, plant, or animal resource base if you were to do nothing or change nothing about what you're doing. So even if something doesn't stand out as a major problem right now, would it eventually become one if you were to do nothing? So that is what I mean by identifying resource concerns. And from there, you can start to define and prioritize your goals. And one thing that helps me is to break it down into different types of goals. So like, what are your production goals? How much do you want to produce? Do you want to produce just a few different types of crops to sell to a certain market? Or are you hoping to produce a wide variety of food for your own sustenance? And then what are your economic goals? Is this going to be your primary source of income, or is it more of a hobby? Is it a hobby now that you want to provide some more income to you in the future? What are your conservation goals? What other forms of life do you want to support through your farming? And how do you want to impact the environment, as a whole through your farming? And then quality of life goals. This is important too. How much time do you want to devote to the project? Do you want to do the labor yourself or pay someone else to do it? Do you want to be the one who's making the decisions, or do you want to kind of steward this project in community? And then finally, what kind of legacy? Oh, my cat's going to join us. What kind of legacy do you want to leave for the people, plants, and animals that come after you in this space? So all of these factors are going to be the foundation of your agroforestry design. So these things are going to determine how you arrange your trees on your land and how you use them like a tool. That's what I always like to remember. Trees are a tool that we can use. So that's the philosophical foundation that I want to lay. And now we're going to talk in more concrete terms about how various agroforestry practices can help address these different goals that you identify. So I'm going to start moving into some real world examples. This is all the philosophy side first. Okay, so the first agroforestry practice that I want to focus on are food forests or forest gardens. And these terms are interchangeable, so you might hear me use both of them. And forest gardens or food forests, again, they're agroforestry systems that mimic the structure and function of early succession forests, and that contain multiple vertical layers of vegetation. Could be up to 8. Some people have up to 8 layers of vegetation. And typically the vegetation is mostly edible or medicinal or useful to humans in some way, or it's providing a specific ecological function that's contributing to the strength of the agroecosystem as a whole. So you can see here in this picture, there are lots of different types of plants all growing in the same area. It does look like a forest that's edible. So when you're short on space, but your main goals are to produce a wide variety of food and a lot of it, like in a backyard, food forests can be a great way to arrange trees. Also, if you're wanting to create a system that's less dependent on inputs, food forests might be a good way to go. So here's a graphic that shows those multiple layers of vegetation that you could have. And there's definitely no recipe or one size fits all. So it's not necessary to include all these layers. These are just some of the layers that you could have in a food forest. So here up top in yellow, a lot of food forests have a layer of taller overstory trees. They could be nut producing like black walnut, or fruit producing. They could be natives like oaks. This layer, it primarily functions to provide shade to the understory below, and potentially to also provide food to humans and wildlife. And then below that in orange here, you could have a layer of shorter understory trees. So they could be fruit trees like apples or pears, or maybe pollinator support trees like in the Pacific Northwest, we've got Saskatoon serviceberry and elderberry. Often shrubs are planted too. That's the pink here in this graphic, like maybe blueberries or currants, aronia, blackberries. So shrubs, they fill in the gaps, helping to kind of maximize vertical space. And oftentimes they're native. You could select them to flower at different times of the year to support pollinators and beneficial insects year round. Vines are often planted too. Sometimes they use trees to grow on kind of like a trellis. Down here in lavender, we've got our herbaceous layer. Plants in this layer could produce food, or they could be nutrient accumulators or provide some other ecological function. We're going to talk about ecological functions in the next slide. There also could be a ground cover layer. This layer could function to cover the soil, to keep it cool, keep it moist, and suppress weeds. But it can also produce food like oregano, nasturtium, even stinging nettle. So ground cover can have a dual purpose. And then some people count root crops as another layer. So this could be things like carrots, beets, even onions, just something that produces food while also breaking up compaction in the soil. So again, you can grow a wide variety of food in a small space when you use this kind of system. And you can also produce a lot of food because, as you can see, you are utilizing that vertical space. So in food forests, it's helpful to select a mix of plants that also have different ecological functions. I promised I was going to talk about that, so here we are. And by ecological functions, I mean roles or processes that can just help support the ecosystem of the land as a whole, beyond just being edible or medicinal or useful to humans. So ideally, plants should be selected intentionally to kind of work together to create an agroecosystem where synergistic interactions are maximized and competitive interactions are reduced. And if you do that, you can create an ecosystem that is a little bit less dependent on inputs. So these are some common ecological functions that I think it's helpful to think about incorporating into a food forest design. And again, it's totally going to depend on what your problems are, your resource concerns, and your goals. But we can go through them. So one example is providing shade. That is an example of an ecological function that trees can provide. So when trees provide shade, they can cool down the microclimate during heat waves. And especially with climate change projections, heat waves are projected to become more common in the coming years. So shade can help protect understory crops from that heat. And they can also protect crops from sunburn. Plants stop photosynthesizing efficiently after 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So if temperatures do reach beyond that, your yields are going to go down, your quality of your crops are going to go down. So shade can be a really important ecological function in those scenarios. Fixing nitrogen and adding fertility to the soil, that could be another ecological function. So plants like legumes are a good example of plants that are fulfilling this ecological function. They fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and that can help reduce reliance on compost and fertilizer. Producing biomass, that is another example of an ecological function. Plants that produce a lot of biomass could be like elderberries. They can be grown and then chopped down or coppiced, and then their biomass can be used to cover the soil like a mulch and add back fertility to the upper soil profiles. So sometimes we call this chop and drop. It's a way to cycle nutrients and cover the soil. Similarly, there are plants that fulfill the ecological function of being nutrient accumulators. So these plants typically have deep roots that mine minerals from deep in the soil. They turn them into above ground biomass. And then when that biomass dies, it produces litter that eventually adds back fertility to the upper soil profile. So it's cycling those nutrients. So comfrey is a great example of a nutrient accumulator. And then some plants fulfill the ecological function of aerating the soil. These could be plants with deep tap roots like daikon radish that break up compacted layers. Or tree roots. Tree roots are going to create macropore channels. Roots are going to break through the soil, and then they'll eventually die back and create these macropores that allow water to infiltrate into the soil and then also create pockets of air for respiration. Another ecological function could be suppressing weeds. So oftentimes you see this in the ground cover layer of a food forest, or cover crops fulfill this function too. And then some plants, covering the soil, same thing. Some plants fulfill the ecological function of providing habitat to beneficial vertebrates like bats or birds of prey, which can control rodents and insects. So oftentimes these are your taller trees like oaks or other natives. Vertebrates really like having some sort of vertical infrastructure in their habitat for shelter. So having trees is a really great way to fulfill this ecological function. And then some plants provide habitat to beneficial insects and also to pollinators. In the Pacific Northwest, examples could be things like yarrow or milkweed, golden currant, arroyo willow. And then alternatively, you could have plants that repel pests. So these could be plants that give off odors that pests don't like onions and rosemary. You could have windbreaks Sheltering wind is an example of an ecological function. So all this to say, there are many different types of ecological functions that you might want to incorporate into your food forest, depending on the issues that you're dealing with and your goals. And again, there really is no recipe. These are just some things to take into consideration when you're selecting species and when you're grouping them together into what we call guilds in a food forest. So I want to go through just an example of a species mix that you could have here in the Pacific Northwest that could fulfill different ecological functions while also providing some sort of benefit to you, like providing food or medicine. So you could select an overstory tree layer like mulberry. Mulberries produce delicious food, and they also produce really nice dappled shade and wind protection to crops below. In the understory tree layer, you could select something like figs. Figs are, of course, delicious, and their roots, just like many trees, can help break up soil compaction. In the shrub layer, you could pick something like elderberry, which of course is medicinal, and also an incredible biomass producer and a major pollinator support species. In the herbaceous crop layer, you could select comfrey, which again, comfrey is a great medicinal. It's a topical medicinal, and it's also a nutrient accumulator, helping to draw nutrients to the surface and cycle them. Then in the ground cover layer, you could pick nasturtium. Nasturtium produces delicious, kind of spicy, edible flowers, and it can also suppress weeds, and it also helps to repel pests. And in that root layer, you could plant daikon radish. Daikon radish is incredible at breaking up soil compaction, and it also produces food. And then in the vine layer, you could choose Concord grape. And there may not be an ecological function for Concord grape, and that is okay. It's still taking advantage of vertical space and helping you produce more in a small area. So this is, again, it's just one example of a species mix here in the Pacific Northwest, but there's no recipe, there's no right or wrong way. These are just some ideas to think about. And ultimately, again, your food forest is going to take whatever form and design it needs to take to create an agro ecosystem that's addressing your goals. It always comes back to your goals. So I want to give an example of a really inspiring small scale site that did this. This is the Festival Beach Food Forest in Austin, Texas. It's not here in the Pacific Northwest, but it's such a neat model that I do just want to talk about it. So this is a public food forest. It's on public parkland. And it started off, it had a really neat story. It started off as an unused piece of parkland near a decommissioned power plant, and it was totally underutilized because it had been next to a power plant for years. So the community got together and sort of brainstormed what they wanted to see happen here. And there were a few different problems that the community identified before the food forest got started. First off, in this area of town, there were not many places for people to gather and connect at. Another problem was that there weren't many opportunities for connection to nature. It was pretty industrial. And then there was a lack of fresh food in this part of town. It was almost considered a food desert. And then, of course, as is so common in many cities, there was a lack of wildlife habitat. So the community got together and they decided to address those problems. They met and they brainstormed for 2 whole years. They had potlucks, and yeah, for 2 years they gathered and they clarified their goals, and they decided that they really wanted to create a space where people could, one, get nourishment that they needed for free, while also connecting to nature and connecting to each other. And then they also wanted to provide habitat for wildlife. So those were the main goals that they identified after addressing their problems and resource concerns. And the solution they came up with was to turn the park into a food forest. It sits on just 3/4 of an acre, but it produces a ton of food. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's unfenced. So everything that's planted, it's edible or medicinal, and people can come and harvest and gather food at any hour of the day. The space also does function as a park still. So people can come sit on benches and utilize the picnic tables and just gather with each other while also gathering food. So it's a really great dual purpose space. And a lot of great outcomes have come from this project. In terms of food production benefits, this food forest has been able to produce a high yield of food in a small space because, again, they're utilizing that vertical space. They're taking advantage of it. And then they're producing a wide variety of food, which is great when you're wanting to provide supplemental nutrition to an entire community that may have different food preferences. They have hundreds of species in this food forest. And again, it's just on 3/4 of an acre, but there are hundreds of species. It's pretty incredible. And there have been some great environmental benefits that have come from this project too. They measured temperature reductions of 15 degrees here in the summer. And if you've ever been to Austin, you know that it gets really hot in the summer. So that 15-degree difference, it can be life-saving. On hot days, people can die from heat-related illnesses. So having a refuge like this in the summer, it can be life-saving. And then on just 3/4 of an acre, they really have been able to provide habitat for wildlife. They've seen migratory birds come through. They've seen rare butterflies pass through. And they've also found some nests of rare birds. So that's pretty cool. You know, it's definitely, it's an intensive project still, you know, I wanna be transparent about that. Food forests are very labor intensive, more so than other kinds of agricultural practices because of their high levels of diversity. So you can see here in this picture, it really does look like a forest. So it can be hard to streamline management tasks in a food forest because of, you know, the wide variety of plants. It can also be hard to mechanize. So forest gardens, food forests, they might not be the best option for production farms because of those labor issues. But in the case of a public park, they can be a great fit. In this case, you know, people in the community volunteer to help with labor tasks. It's part of the community building activities, and people are doing their own harvesting because they're coming, they're foraging. So in the case of this kind of scenario, labor typically isn't as much of a limiting factor. There have been some incredible benefits to the community that have come from this too. And again, serving the community was the main goal of this project. The food forest, it serves as a gathering place for people to come together. People can forage side by side. There are volunteer days. There's things like yoga in the park, potlucks, plant ID walks. And that really has served to bring the community together. You know, I got to visit this site, and I got to talk with neighbors who met other neighbors who they didn't know were their neighbors, and now they've built support systems together. People have really found belonging in this space. And as we know, finding belonging, finding community, that is a fundamental human need. And there are also a lot of great educational events that are hosted here that teach people how to grow their own food. So there are ripple effects that are coming out of this. So people are not only getting to harvest food from this site, but they're also learning how to grow their own food in their own backyard settings. So that's pretty neat too. And all these different community activities, they really do serve to improve mental well-being, cultivate a sense of community, and also increase food security. So I just wanted to mention this project. I thought it was pretty inspiring. Okay, so that was food forests. But again, all of these different agroforestry practices can be applied to small spaces. So now I want to talk about alley cropping. And again, alley cropping is when you have rows of trees that are intercropped with rows of an understory crop between them. So this is an example, this picture here is an example of a small scale alley cropping system. You can see here there are espaliered apple trees, and actually that's tomato that's intercropped in between. So some potential benefits in backyard or small scale settings. Alley cropping systems can support increased production. So just like food forests, they're taking advantage of vertical space. The individual yield of species typically can go down in alley cropping systems because of competition between species, but the total yield of both crops combined often goes up because of the smart utilization of vertical space. So like, for example, in this system, your yield of your apple crop might go down a little bit, your yield of your tomato crop might go down a little bit, but your combined yield will typically go up. And it all depends, but that is typically the trend that we see. Another benefit, having this vertical infrastructure of trees, as opposed to having one layer of a monoculture, again, it can provide habitat for beneficial wildlife like birds, bats, pollinators, beneficial insects. Again, those animals, they like to have a vertical structure for shelter, and alley cropping can help provide this. And alley cropping can also help regulate the microclimate. I think this is a big one, especially when we're planning for climate change. Trees can provide shade to crops on hot days. That's a really big one. And then even in the winter, trees can take in heat during the day and then radiate it out to crops below at night. And that can help prevent frost damage in some cases. On really cold nights, it's not going to make a difference, but on kind of those marginal days, like maybe in the spring, it can make a difference then. And then alley cropping can also help reduce erosion. So tree roots can grab onto the soil, hold it in place. This is really important, especially on slopes and especially if we're experiencing extreme precipitation. And then tree roots, similarly, they also increase the amount of water that can infiltrate into the soil by, again, creating those macropores, those channels that water can flow down and into. So this allows more water to slowly sink into the soil instead of running off the top and carrying your topsoil with it. So a lot of potential benefits, depending on what your goals are. And the real world example that I want to jump into is right here in my own backyard. So I live on 5 acres in eastern San Diego County. I live on a community farm with 5 other people. So yeah, there are 6 of us. We're trying to start a little community farm. And the land in total is 5 acres, but our production space that we're focusing on it's really just 1/4 of an acre. And we do have quite a few major problems and resource concerns. First, we do have an extreme slope. It's 25%. And so when it rains, there is a ton of erosion. This picture up top, this is what happened to our other hill when our upslope neighbors took out their old avocado orchard and they scalped the land and they took away the living roots in the soil. It rained and the soil was bare and all of the soil eroded and washed down onto our land, covered our road. It was not a fun time. So we know that that is what could happen to our production area too, if we don't get living roots in the soil. So we definitely want to avoid that erosion. Another problem we have is that our nearest grocery store is 30 minutes away. Very strange. We're here in San Diego County, an hour from downtown, but we're still far enough out there that our nearest grocery store is 30 minutes away. So a goal of ours is to produce our own food so that we don't have to drive 30 minutes so often. And we're also hoping to sell the surplus at a local farm stand. And then another problem that we have is high heat. So this slope right here, it's south facing. And in the summer, it gets to be 110 degrees pretty regularly. So we want to figure out a way to provide shade to our vegetables so that we can still produce vegetables even in the summer during those really hot months. And we want to provide them with shade so that they don't just die. And then lastly, another resource concern that we have that's not an issue right now, but that very well might be a resource concern down the line is the lack of wildlife habitat. So right now we do have habitat for wildlife around, but there is rapid development happening all around. There's raw land next door to us that's actually for sale. And if that does get developed, a lot of wildlife habitat will be gone. So we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to promote wildlife habitat in our own backyard, in our own production system as much as possible. So those are our goals, those are our problems, those are our resource concerns. So based on those problems and resource concerns, the solution that we've come up with is to plant an alley cropping system on contoured terraces on our hillside. So we're going to be planting different kinds of fruit trees with shade tolerant vegetables planted in the rows between. So here on the right, it's kind of hard to tell, but the land in the top picture, that's what it looks like now. No trees, no terraces. And the picture below where you see those 3 red lines, that's our hypothetical after. So the red lines delineate where we're planning on putting our lines of trees. We did a contour analysis through Google Earth to figure that out. And again, with climate change, we are expected to get increased periods of extreme rain, which can lead to more erosion. So we're really hoping that by having trees in the ground, we can stabilize the slope and make it more resilient in the face of that extreme precipitation. And then again, as I mentioned, we're also hoping to provide shade from trees so that we can produce vegetables during those really hot months. So the picture on the left, this is what the land looks like now from a different angle. So we did clear and grade 1 terrace. We have 3 more to go, and we planted 1 row of trees. So it's kind of hard to tell. You can see the really little trees in there, but they are there. But the picture on the right shows you the plan delineated lines a little bit more clearly. So you can see where the sun is, that's our south facing slope. Again, we're getting a lot of sun exposure from that left side. And then you can see our tree row in that with that blue line, the alley crop, that's going to be our understory vegetable crop. And then again, we're going to have another tree crop a little bit higher up. We have not graded that part yet, but that's what we're planning on doing. So if the presentation were a few months from now, I'd have much better pictures to show you. So I apologize, but you know, this project is ongoing and evolving, but it is a good start. We're off to a good start. And so again, this project is just getting started, so we don't have any concrete outcomes, but we do have quite a few hopes. We are wanting to plant a diverse mix of species, and we're hoping that by doing that, we can support beneficial insects and pollinators and other animals. In this picture, we do have some cute bats that have recently moved into our attic. We love bats and we want to provide a habitat and a home for them, just not in our attic. So we are installing a bat box, and trees on landscapes can support populations of bats by providing them with pollen and insects, and again, that vertical shelter. Bats really do prefer having that vertical infrastructure on a farm, so trees can be a really important part of their habitat. So again, our hope is that our alley cropping system can provide them with an abundance of insects and shelter. That way they can stay here on our land, just not in our attic. And we do also have bees. We're producing honey. So we're planting quite a few fruit trees for our own consumption, but we're also mixing in some elderberries, which we're hoping will provide a source of nectar for our bees. Elderberries down here, they flower a little bit later than some of our other native wildflowers. So we hope that they'll provide a source of nutrition at times of the year when the bees might not otherwise have much. This is a picture down at the bottom of some of the elderberries that we're going to be propagating. So all in all, you know, we're hoping to satisfy a few different production and conservation goals by arranging trees in this pattern. So that was alley cropping. And the next practice I want to focus on are riparian forest buffers. So again, riparian forest buffers are bands of trees and shrubs, and sometimes forbs and grasses, alongside stream banks and waterways, with the goal of protecting those waterways. And in urban and residential areas, they can be particularly important because when rain and irrigation water moves across yards and streets and parking lots, it picks up things like turf chemicals and oils and other pollutants that eventually end up in our water. So riparian forest buffers are really important at helping to filter out those contaminants and also slow down the flow of water. And they can also provide wildlife habitat. So this is one example of a smaller neighborhood riparian forest buffer on land owned by the city of Austin in Texas. This is a really inspiring project. The city of Austin, they did a floodplain buyout project a few years ago. So this area, it used to be a neighborhood that had been experiencing repeated flooding over the course of many years, actually decades. And these homes were just repeatedly getting destroyed by floods. And so to avoid the loss of life and property, the city decided to offer an optional buyout of those residents' homes to incentivize them to locate to a safer part of town. And, you know, having to choose between losing your home to either a flood or to a buyout project, that is never an easy choice. The people in this community, they lost their homes, and that is real trauma. But what the city decided to do with that land after people relocated, it was pretty inspiring. So the process was that first the city, you know, provided people the option to relocate. If people did opt into that, the city paid them. Then they demolished the homes, and they did a rehabilitation project to phytoremediate the land and the soil using native grasses and trees. After that phytoremediation process was over, eventually they planted a small community orchard in the place where the housing has been. So now people can come here and they can harvest from that orchard, gather food, spend time together, enjoy nature. It functions like a park too. And because of that, you know, this place that once housed so much trauma, it's beginning to heal. And then another thing that the city did was that they created a small riparian forest buffer between the community orchards and that creek. And that's what you see in this top picture here. So you can see they intentionally left some trees, and they also planted more native trees and shrubs. It's really hard to tell in this picture, but you can see little stems. Those are newly planted baby trees and shrubs in between the taller trees. And these trees and shrubs are going to function to stabilize that stream bank and promote more infiltration when floods do come through. Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when in the case of this floodplain. And so by having more living roots in the soil here, that will encourage more water infiltration into these areas, which hopefully can mitigate the severity of floods. Floods are still going to happen, but hopefully it can mitigate the severity just a little bit. And then also these trees are, in the summer, they're going to be providing shade to the creek, which helps keep the water temperature cool. That is very important for aquatic wildlife to be able to thrive, especially in the face of climate change when temperatures are projected to increase. So again, it's such a neat project. This area, it was once developed and it's now regrowing into a healthy, functioning ecosystem. So that was riparian forest buffers. On to the next agroforestry practice of small-scale silvopasture. And again, silvopasture is the integration of trees with animals and forage in the same system. So in a backyard setting, small livestock are best. I'm assuming most of us aren't going to have cattle in our backyard, maybe a few of us, but probably for most small scale settings, smaller livestock are probably the most appropriate. Poultry are great. If you do have a few acres, you could try a few sheep or goats. And trees provide animals with protection from extreme heat, along with protection from wind and rain too. So just protection from the elements. And especially in a warming world, that protection from extreme heat is really important. Animals do experience heat stress above just 75 degrees. So having that shade can really help animals to grow faster. If they're milk producing animals, it's been shown that silvopasture can help promote more milk production. And then it can also reduce mortality. So really, really important. And then in a backyard setting, there's also another added benefit, multiple sources of food or income on one unit of land. And then also animals can help with weed and pest control. Chickens can eat all sorts of bugs in your garden. In an orchard, if you do have fallen fruit, they can help eat the bugs or pathogens that are living in that fruit, which can help just stop those pest cycles for the coming season. Some animals can also help mow down weeds or cover crops, and they can also add back fertility to the soil in the form of manure. So this is a picture of the Youth Garden Project in Moab, Utah. As you can see in the system, they've got a stone fruit orchard. In this case, it's peaches, and then they've got chickens that are rotated underneath. An integral component of silvopasture is rotational grazing. So if you are going to employ it, you do want to make sure that you're moving animals often, even if that just means dividing your backyard into different paddocks or moving chickens with a chicken tractor. Moving animals is good for them. It prevents the spread of pathogens because they're not eating where they defecate. It's also really good for the grass and pasture, as pasture, of course, it needs time without being grazed to grow and regenerate. So that is one consideration with small scale silvopasture. You don't just want to let your chickens roam free in the backyard. It really is important to manage them well. And these pictures here, they're not of silvopasture per se, but they do demonstrate the importance of rotational grazing in backyard settings. So this picture up top, it's from the Manzo Elementary School in Tucson, Arizona. The chickens here are used to mow their lawn. So as long as you don't leave them in one spot for too long, chickens are a great lawnmower. In the bottom picture here, this is from my neighbors, Bailey's Backyard Bounty here in San Diego. And they move their chickens every day in this mobile chicken tractor. And similarly, the chickens are used to mow down their cover crop. So that was silvopasture. We're to the last practice here. So bear with me, I know I'm going through a lot. The last practice that I want to touch on are windbreaks and hedgerows. And again, windbreaks are linear plantings of trees that function to slow down wind and also provide habitat to wildlife and pollinators. In backyards, they can also be great for providing privacy. They can also serve as a buffer against pollutants and odors, which can be especially helpful if you do live in a city. Backyards actually often do have some sort of hedgerow in place as a privacy barrier, but if you select an edible tree species, you can get the benefit of both privacy and then also wildlife habitat, plus the benefit of producing food. So this graphic is a great example. The font might be a little bit small to read, but you can see kind of from the top, we've got a house. And in the backyard, there's a hedgerow with edible species like Nanking cherry, elderberry, sand cherry, chokecherry, hazelnut, red currant, dogwood, and more. So those are examples of dual purpose windbreaks. So this is, again, these are my neighbors, Bailey's Backyard Bounty Farm. They are wonderful. And they have a few different hedgerows on their property. They planted a row of oranges along their roadside. This provides privacy from the road, which is great, while also buffering some air pollution. So it's just a little bit of buffering. Ideally, having 3 rows of vegetation, that's going to provide the maximum amount of buffering capacity, but even just 1 row is going to provide something. And then up top here, they also planted a hedgerow of pomegranates between their backyard and the neighbor's chicken house. So that is really helping to block odors from that chicken house. And the pomegranates, of course, also provide that dual purpose of producing food, which the Baileys are selling at their farm stand. So those are all the different agroforestry practices scaled down on a small scale. And all these different practices that I went through, I think it's important to remember that they're interrelated to one another. There is not really a black and white line separating these practices from one another. In reality, they're found along a gradient. So when you're designing your space, you might want to just use 1 or 2 of these practices in combination with other conservation practices, or you could draw from the design principles of practices that resonate with you, or you could design your trees and arrange them in a completely new way. So really there is no right or wrong way to do this. I think the important thing to remember is that behind all these practices are design principles. So focus on the design principles and don't think of this as like a recipe for your farm. So with that, I think I want to pause here and see if there are any questions. Next, we're going to talk about planning and design considerations, but if anyone does have questions here, we can pause and answer them. I can stop sharing.
Yeah, let's see here. So we have a couple of things. I'll just start from the top. I had the question about what was the time frame to achieve the state in the photos in Austin?
That's a great question. That food forest was started in 2017.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
So
achievable.
it's already grown
right?
quite a bit. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, and Janine, wonderful Janine, for who we have to thank for having you here, said, "Hi, Catherine. What are ways we can get access to land for community forest projects? Do you have any
That's a great
recommendations?"
question. Yeah, that's a really good question, especially I think in the context of community projects. If you're doing a project with other people, oftentimes you aren't the owner of the land and people have to figure out other creative ways to obtain land. So like in the case of that Austin Festival Beach Food Forest project that I went through, they were able to create a stewardship agreement with the city of Austin. So it was a nonprofit called Fruitful Commons, and they entered into an agreement with the Parks and Recreation Department of the city. And so the land does belong to the city still, but this nonprofit is in charge of managing it. Other community projects like this, there's so many different ones. There's a really neat community land trust in Boston called the Boston Food Forest Coalition. And they actually work on identifying undevelopable land in the city, and then offering to buy that from the city. And then they put that land into a community land trust that is owned by the collective. So they work really closely with Boston's Department of Development, and they work with that department to identify plots of land that are just not, they're kind of marginal pieces of land. It's costing the city more money to maintain that land, and they're not generating income from that. So most cities do have some plots of land like that that are just kind of, a money pit for them. So they're kind of eager to either lease that land for a low amount or even sell that land in some cases. So I think going to your municipality or your county, seeing if there is any land like that. Parks and Recs Department, they also often have land that, same thing. It might be costing them a lot to maintain it. It might be not really used by the community, and they might want someone else to take over management. So I think those are two ways of kind of going about obtaining land in creative ways. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Yeah, the school that my kids went to, they had, it was kind of it was a program of the public school, and they had a regular garden, and then they also had a food forest garden. So schools might be another opportunity. Or I was thinking, even where there are community gardens, you could see if, however it's managed, if people are open to the idea of developing part of it into food forests, and if people see how that goes, then kind of seeing that, most gardens are maximizing sun, which is, one of the things that I always kind of wonder about. And I liked what you said about the combined yield being up. And yeah, so many great examples. Let's see here. Doug says, how do you keep deer out and prevent them from eating your crop?
Oh, what a great question. That is what a constant battle. I really think exclusionary tactics are the best with deer. Deer fencing is a really big investment, but I think that deer fencing is pretty much the best way to go about that. Tree tubes are great for smaller trees, but if you can afford it, deer fencing is a great option. Yeah, I've heard other things like people using oh my goodness, Irish Spring soap, but I think the best methods are exclusionary methods.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Rebecca says, I mean, this is, you're speaking nationally here, but is there a training for parks departments on planting and maintaining food forests?
That's a great question. Nothing yet. At the National Agroforestry Center, we are in the process of developing a community of practice for people who are interested in specifically community agroforestry projects and urban agroforestry projects. So it's just in the planning phases, and it won't launch for a few more years, but eventually that will be a space where hopefully we can bring together people who've done this with people who want to do it. So that will include municipalities who've been through the process and who can really talk about what it looked like for them, because I think it's going to be different for every place. Every city and county has their own regulatory processes, and I think the best way is just for people who've done it to share what's worked for them. So we will be doing that. If you sign up for our newsletter, an announcement for that will go out, probably not for a long while, but that is in the works.
Okay.
So
Well,
really
there are some amazing examples. So it's probably very much like inquire locally, see what's possible, be the squeaky wheel to make it happen.
And I think there's no roadmap. I think
right.
with the Festival Beach Food Forest, their parks department didn't have experience with that. And it was really a learning process for both parties. It took years, and it was just a lot of conversations, very slow. The parks department had to put some new processes in place. They had to create some loopholes in their existing regulations.
Right.
So, policy changes are always really slow, but I think, it can happen for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have now, so we can go on with what you have next.
Okay, cool. And I do want to say really quick, because you brought up a really good point, Rachel, about maximizing sunlight. And how do we do that if we've got shade, from trees? And I think a really important consideration is proper tree crop combination, because sun-loving crops are not going to do well in the shade. But there are a lot of crops that will benefit from some shade, especially if you've got high temperatures from climate change. Again, plants do stop photosynthesizing after a certain temperature. So if that is something you're experiencing, your plants will benefit from some shade. But it really, it's about pairing them correctly. So like broccoli is going to do better in the shade than tomatoes. It's just going to depend. So I think it's a lot of trial and error. So, but good point. So
yeah, okay.
Okay.
All right.
I'll
Onward.
start sharing my screen again. Okay. So planning and design considerations. Yeah, we've talked about the different tree arrangements and how you could apply them to a smaller scale. And now, yeah, let's dive into the planning and design and implementation considerations. I think, let me see if I can, there we go. So first off, challenges. I think one of the most important considerations to take into account from the beginning are that agroforestry systems do come with their own set of challenges. And being aware of those challenges up front is really important just so you can start planning on how you're going to address them. High startup costs are an example of a common challenge. Trees can be expensive to plant and it can take years for them to yield a harvest. Trees mature and produce a yield after 4 to 5 years or more. So that delay in income or in food production for your own consumption, that could be a financial setback. Here's my cat again. Managing competition between species is also a challenge. Agroforestry is inherently diverse, and that diversity does mean that different species in your system, they're going to be interacting. And some of those interactions will be beneficial, but some of those interactions will be competitive. And as we just talked about, one of the resources that trees and crops commonly compete for is light. If you've got trees and crops in one unit of area, the trees are going to be capturing light and preventing it from reaching those understory layers. Some light does pass through, of course, but trees can alter not only the quantity of light that passes through, but also the quality of light. So the red to far red ratio, which can affect photosynthesis. So again, tree crop combination is really important. Some understory crops are fine with reduced levels of light and with different qualities of light. Some understory crops aren't. So it's just a matter of figuring out what trees you've got and what understory crops you have. And then I think with that, also selecting trees with what we call a low leaf area index. What I mean by that is trees that have a lower leaf area index are trees that allow more light to pass through. If trees have a higher leaf area index, that means that they're going to be more dense and they're going to allow less light to pass through. So just making sure that, if you've got a sun-loving crop in the understory, make sure you're pairing it with a tree that allows a lot of light to pass through. So that pairing is really important. And then another resource that trees and crops often compete for is water, and then nutrients as well. So being prepared to manage that competition, both with how we design our species combinations and also arrangement, and then also our management strategies, that is really going to be an important consideration. Another challenge is that as a system becomes more diverse, it is inherently going to become more complicated to manage. It's going to mean more record keeping. It's going to mean more knowledge about different types of crops and just more intensive management in general. It also might mean more labor on the ground. So figuring out how you're going to address that is really important. And then also, with that, in small scale agroforestry systems, we're often not going to be using big equipment. So a lot of our labor will be manual, which means we do have to be even more strategic with how we're going to lay out our design so that we can facilitate movement and flow through our space. All of these challenges definitely can be addressed. I think one of the best ways to deal with them is to start small. Observe your system, start small. That way you can sort of deal with them as they come along. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day. I think another consideration that it's really important to think about, it's just the importance of thinking holistically. You know, again, agroforestry practices are not going to be a silver bullet solution, just like nothing is a silver bullet solution. You know, really, I think the best way to go about designing an agro ecosystem is to think holistically and realize that agroforestry practices are just a few solutions among many that we can use. And they can complement other conservation practices as well. So this is an example of a small urban agroforestry farm here in San Diego. It's called Costa Roots Farm. I used to work here, and they've got an alley cropping system. It's hard to see, but there are different rows of elderberries and pomegranates here. And then in between, they've got alley cropping vegetables in the understory, and then they rotate those vegetables with chickens. So it's an alley cropping system and then a silvopasture system as well. But they also have cover cropping and composting and silvopasture and crop rotation. So the point here is that agroforestry practices are actually strengthened when they're used in concert with other conservation practices as well. So it's important to think about designing our systems holistically, and oftentimes that means stacking different practices together. And then species selection is another big consideration, and that comes with its whole own set of things to think about. As we talked about before, when we're selecting species, we do want to think about choosing plants that work together to fulfill an ecological function. We want to think about the system as a whole. So what is your system needing that a certain plant could provide? And again, we kind of went through all these different example ecological functions. It's also important to think about how a species is going to affect everything around it. So for example, if I choose this species, what is that going to mean for the water cycle, for the soil, for the microbes in the soil? What is that going to mean for the carbon in the air, for the sunlight that passes through, for the wildlife, the wind, the minerals, the pollinators, and the other plants? Of course, you know, it goes without saying, but everything is connected. So just making sure you're thinking about all these different components of your ecosystem whenever you make a decision, that's a good practice to do. And then beyond that, some other considerations, especially for smaller scales, are how is the species going to work in my small space? So selecting dwarf varieties of trees is often helpful when you don't have access to big harvest equipment or ladders. The espalier technique, like we see here in the bottom picture, that's another space saver. You can prune trees so they grow flat on a wall or a trellis. That can really help save space. It can also help streamline management tasks like pruning and harvesting. And then selecting combination fruit trees, like what we see here in the picture on the left, where there are multiple types of fruits grafted onto the same tree. That is also an option for small spaces. For this to work, trees have to be in the same family with similar cell structures, but it can be a good idea in a small space. And then when you're picking species, it's also important to consider things like climate and weather. No matter what, you're going to want to pick plants adapted to your USDA plant hardiness zone. Knowing your first and last frost date is also helpful. You don't want to plant things that will sprout before your last frost date. Climate.gov is a good website to figure this out. And then planting plants that work well with the amount of natural precipitation you get is good. I always go to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, for this kind of data. Soil type and structure and fertility are important to keep in mind when selecting species too. A soil test can help you identify what nutrients you need to add to your soil, but Web Soil Survey is also a great tool. This is a tool from NRCS, and it can help you identify things like the depth to the water table, your soil texture, your soil type, and dozens of other soil characteristics. And then once you gather all that information, there are a number of other tools that I found helpful in really honing in on the species that you're wanting. One tool is the USDA Plants Database. You can filter results by selecting different growth habits. So for example, tree and shrub and subshrub or vine. So this tool is great. It basically allows you to select plants in different layers of a food forest. And then plants for a future, that's another great tool. You can select plants based off their edible rating or their medicinal rating or their ecological function. So I think that's really great. And then local nurseries are always really great resources. They will let you know the specific cultivars that are adapted to your specific microclimate. We already talked about this a little bit, but another big consideration in design is spacing. So again, it's always good to anticipate what your labor flows are going to look like. Think about what your day-to-day tasks are going to look like, what your harvest will look like, and just try to visualize how your tree spacing is going to affect that. So in this picture on the left, this is a food forest. Plants are arranged more in a free-form pattern, and that is great, and it's beautiful, and systems like this can maximize some of those synergistic interactions that happen between species, but it will also mean higher labor and time inputs. So that's the trade-off here. Versus the picture on the right, if you arrange trees in a more linear pattern, with maybe some sort of walkway, that can help you just have a little bit more ease of management and ease of harvest as well. So that can save you a lot on labor. So again, it all just comes back to what your goals are. And then understanding your city or county's municipal regulations is also very important. HOA rules are important too. Zoning laws are always important to be aware of. Your municipality may also regulate what kind of farm infrastructure you can have. You may need to get permits for things like sheds and hoop houses. Some people have reported not being able to have visible compost piles. Cities also have regulations about what kinds of animals and how many animals you can have. So just make sure you're aware of your own municipality's regulations going into it. And then utilities, it's always important to think about where you're going to get your utilities from. You might, already have utilities at your home, but if you're starting a project in a public setting, you may have to work with your municipality to get new meters. That can often be expensive, but I will say it is worth working with your municipality to see if you can get around some of those high costs associated with getting new meters. Oftentimes for agricultural production, there are exceptions. Another important thing to consider is that before you start digging, there can be below ground utilities that are hidden. So it's important to call 811, the call before you dig hotline. They will come out and they'll locate your below ground utilities for you. So that's a great free resource. Beware of overhead utilities too. If you've got telephone wires, make sure you're not planting trees under them because that can be a big fire hazard down the line. Contamination, especially in urban areas, is another thing to be aware of. In urban environments, toxins can come from cars and roads and factories, landscaping as well, because of the applications of pesticides and fertilizers. So this can result in higher levels of things like heavy metals and hydrocarbons, pathogens, pesticide residues. But there is a lot that we can do to prevent this. You can find out what kind of previous development may have been at your site by looking up county records, or just by looking on Google Earth. You can go and look at historic development data. If you do suspect there to be a contamination, or if you just want to be safe, you can always do a soil test for heavy metals. Sometimes contamination can be remedied through phytoremediation, which is the process of using living plants to clean up contaminated soil. So plants, especially woody perennials, can break down organic pollutants like hydrocarbons. They can't break down heavy metals, but they can hyperaccumulate them, meaning they can absorb them and concentrate them in their above ground biomass, so in their stems and trunks. And then that biomass can be cut down and removed from the site. So that's a way to kind of just gather those toxins from the soil and remove them from the site. If your contamination is very severe though, you can look into the EPA's brownfields program. Brownfields are former industrial or commercial sites that are determined by the EPA to have a severe environmental contamination. If a site does meet this criteria, it will be eligible for grants that will fund an actual intensive reclamation project. So most sites aren't going to require that though. Usually phytoremediation is enough at most sites. Additionally, it is worth mentioning that perennial fruiting plants are better than annual fruiting plants at preventing toxins from accumulating in fruit. So in other words, if an apple and a strawberry were grown on the same contaminated soil, the apple would be less contaminated than the strawberry. And that's just because the woody biomass in perennial trunks and stems, again, it accumulates and denatures toxins before they arrive at those fruiting bodies. So that's just some fun food for thought. You know, if you are farming in an area where you've got suspected contamination, a perennial fruit tree is probably a safer bet than an annual fruiting crop. Weed management is going to look different on a smaller scale as opposed to a larger scale. Small spaces sometimes lack access to equipment that is normally used on a small scale. And then also, if we're growing in places where we also live, we're probably going to want to stray away from using herbicides. So there are definitely some non-toxic weed management strategies that you can use. Occultation is an option. That is the process of smothering weeds with a dark plastic tarp. Solarization and biosolarization are similar. That's the process of layering and sealing clear plastic over weeds. Tillage with chickens or with the walk-behind tractor is an option. Mulching, mowing, sheet mulching is effective. Sheet mulching, that's what you see here in this picture. That's when you can layer down cardboard with mulch. And then cover cropping is also a great way to suppress weeds. And just like with weed management, when you're managing pests on a small scale or where you live, you might want to avoid using toxic pesticides. Organic pesticides are a less toxic alternative, but a note with that one, even organic pesticides can still be toxic and still require you to wear the proper personal protective equipment and avoid re-entering within a certain time period. So just make sure you're reading labels even with organic pesticides. But preventative measures are often what growers go for. So exclusionary strategies like deer fencing, like we mentioned, gopher baskets are a great option for preventing gophers, bird netting and floating row cover. Those are great ways that you can prevent pest damage. And then biological pest control is also really great. So that can come from encouraging natural enemy insects and mites. You can do that again, like we talked about, by planting insectaries or shrubs that flower at different times of the year. And then bat and owl boxes are great ways to encourage natural vertebrate pest control. Equipment is another consideration. Small scale equipment is very different from large scale equipment. This is a table that I think is helpful for breaking down what kinds of small scale equipment you might need for various management tasks. This is on our website. I'm going to provide a QR code that'll take you directly to the page where we have this resource. And then finally, the last consideration I want to talk about is planning for future climate risks. Like we talked about many times today, it's important to plan around your existing problems and your existing resource concerns, but it's also important to plan for what problems might affect your land down the line. And this can be really difficult because it's impossible to predict the future. But luckily, there are a lot of great scientific models that can provide estimates for the kinds of risks we might expect to see in a given location. So some good tools for finding out what your future climate risks are include the 5th National Climate Assessment. This is the US government's leading report on climate change impacts and risks. There are different chapters for different regions. So there's a Northwest chapter, and it can tell you what climate risks are likely to affect your region. The Climate Mapper is another tool developed by the Climate Hubs. And there are lots of different tools on the USDA Northwest Climate Hubs website. So that's it. We've talked about quite a lot, and I want to just give a little recap to weave it all together. Again, we talked about what agroforestry is, agroforestry's indigenous roots, and how it can be applied in today's modern world to address our modern problems. We talked about some of those problems that land stewards are commonly facing and common ways to arrange trees in small spaces to address those problems and resource concerns and goals, and even future climate risks. We went through some on-the-ground examples of small-scale agroforestry in action. And we also talked about other planning and design considerations to think about. So what can we do from here? I do have a few personal action items or steps that we can all think about as we go forward. So this is our homework. Number one, write down the problems and resource concerns that you are currently facing in your area. And number two, look up those projected problems and resource concerns that you might face in the future in your production system, based on things like those projections from climate models, and also just based on your own observations. And then finally, go through the 6 different agroforestry practices that I listed and just think about some of the design principles behind them. And then based on those design principles and those problems that you've identified, see if you can come up with one way that you can arrange trees on your land to address those goals. So I will leave you with that. If you do have questions that don't get answered in the Q&A, please feel free to reach out to my email. And this QR code, if you scan it, it'll take you directly to the National Agroforestry Center website, where we have a lot of great resources on urban and community agroforestry in specific, and many more resources in addition to that. So I guess I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Terrific. That's great. Wonderful. What good information. I loved a lot of what you were talking about. Your process is the process that we go through with the land steward training that we host for landowners. Just that whole kind of identifying your goals, assessing your resources, whatever they are, kind of figuring out what your concerns are, prioritizing, lots of great things. Very, very familiar and good. Another thing that I wanted to mention, I love that riparian areas are considered an agroforestry process or system. That was cool. And then one other thing, here in our area, we think a lot about fire. Obviously, probably in San Diego you do too, but windbreaks can also act as screen breaks when you have like a lot of food producing trees have moisture rich vegetation, and they can be an ember screen in fires and actually help to, screen your home if it's, placed in the right way. So that can be another benefit. So those are just a few highlights that I wanted to point out. And we do have a couple more questions in the chat.
Great.
So Doug again says, are there edible tree, shrub, perennial, ground cover, vine species with known companion symbiotic relationships that help each other with providing water nutrients, for example, mycorrhizal relationships?
That's such a great question. Most trees do form mycorrhizal associations. So yeah, you could have a food producing tree that is also forming those mycorrhizal associations and helping other crops around. Also, something that is so neat, there's a phenomenon called hydraulic redistribution of water that trees also perform. And so, yeah, trees can draw up water from deeper soil profiles and irrigate it out to surrounding crops. And then they can do the same with nutrient transfer through those mycorrhizal channels. So even if a tree is food producing, they often can provide those other ecosystem services to surrounding crops.
Yeah, nice. I've seen a couple of sort of small scale, but food producing, for business people talking about, and I'm sure there's a special word for it, but about it, just kind of gardening like agroforestry, where you're gardening in succession. So, and I've noticed that even in my own garden, just as an example, I have a scrabbly little place of mint, which I know can become invasive, but I like to have some mint, and it's kind of in a contained spot, and it's never done very well until my native ginger has gotten big enough to kind of go over there, and I put some native bleeding heart, and as soon as the mint could like be in with other things, it's just taken off. So definitely sometimes I, at any rate, am not aware of what's going on, but I've often noticed that plants are happier in companionship than they are just like spaced, in your classic 10 to 12 inches, give it all that space, so.
Totally. Yeah. It doesn't have to be just the perennials that are positively affecting the microclimate. It's just diversity in general. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. And Rebecca says, I've read of successful solar and culture combinations in Italy. Tall solar providing shade with orange and lemon trees. Neat. Have you seen examples of this in the U.S.? That's a good point.
That is really, really neat. That is becoming more and more common. There is an agri-solar clearinghouse at the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and they do have some examples of systems like that. Yeah, abroad and here in the US. I think it's true because the solar it's very similar to trees. You know, solar isn't providing habitat for wildlife, but it is providing that ecological function of shade. So depending on your goals, a solar system could function similarly to what a tree would do. Yeah, really good point.
Yeah, and I think I've seen it with sheep also,
Yes.
maybe not as tall, but with sheep grazing underneath. And there are a number of examples of people. I mean, sometimes it can be that sort of industrial maintenance model, but here we have a couple of examples of solar places that are planting native meadow sort of habitat underneath. So that's also providing habitat in that way too. Nice.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting that that's.
Yeah, there's so much. It really does feel like a burgeoning field. So Janine says, excellent presentation, Catherine. Thank you for presenting to our land steward community. Yes.
Thank you.
And then one more question. Blaine says, do you have recommendations for where to buy larger quantities of fruit trees, berry bushes, etc., looking to put in a small syntropic agroforestry system and trying to source plants, maybe a wholesale nursery?
That is a great question. You know, right now, that is definitely an issue. I think nationally there is quite a bit of demand for trees and shrubs, which is wonderful. And nurseries are just kind of struggling to keep up with that demand just because, you know, it's this influx of demand right now, which is wonderful. And so it can be difficult. I don't know of any nurseries in particular. I wish I could answer that question in a more helpful way. Yeah, just keep searching. Yeah,
kind of depending on the scale that you want to put in. I mean, personally, I've just done sort of little by little, and I'm in an urban lot, but kind of converted a totally paved driveway gradually into. I like the idea of. I'm very into perennials. I'm kind of a lazy gardener, so I like to plant them and then have them give me food over time and native plants. But I've used rain tree, but I don't know if they're expensive, but I would just try to buy a few every year. But if you're trying to do something all at once, that could be different, but you could stagger your purchases. So, well, that was great. I'm so glad this is happening, and you're such a good resource. It was really nice. Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, this was really great. Thanks for having me.
And for everyone on the Zoom, I will sometime tomorrow, you'll get the recording and PDF, and also the link to go with the steps that Catherine recommended. And you can look at our whole sustainable living series and cruise through and see if you want to watch other recordings and do other steps. All right. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.